As usual, there was a lot going on in the Middle East, and what I'd like to do in this video is talk about a number of different stories that have been developing that we've been talking about in some of our recent videos that all point to two key mistakes that the Trump administration, the United States, is making in its approach to the Middle East. For all the good that the Trump administration is doing, I believe that these two major errors, major mistakes, errors in judgment, are leading to a lot of problems that are going to be difficult to solve in the future. So let's get right to it. First, we have an announcement that was made just a couple of days ago that the United States has decided to sanction key individuals who have been facilitating the funding of Hezbollah. So what happened here is the U.S. Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets decided to sanction key individuals who have been responsible for channeling tens of millions of dollars from Iran to Hezbollah during 2025. They specifically named Osama Jaber, Jafar Muhammad Qasir, and Samar Kazbar, who are key players in Hezbollah's financial network. The sanctioning of individuals moving money from Iran to Hezbollah, and reportedly, we're talking about $1 billion that has been moved from Iran to Hezbollah in 2025 alone. At the same time, as we talked about in our previous video, the United States is pressuring the Israelis to allow safe passage for dozens of Hamas terrorists who are holed up in a tunnel in Rafah, to allow them to go over to the other side of the yellow line into Hamas-controlled territory. Israel does not want to allow this safe passage. These are terrorists who have been in violation of the ceasefire and were responsible for the deaths of Israeli soldiers, and Israel sees no reason why, while Hamas is still holding bodies of Israeli hostages and are in violation of the ceasefire, they should allow this. But the Americans are pressuring the Israelis to allow these terrorists safe passage, essentially amnesty, because they would not get arrested by the Israelis. And we talked about this in the previous video. Why is the U.S. doing it? And I suggested that they're doing this because this would show that the ceasefire is working, because you would have the visual of Hamas terrorists laying down their weapons and being granted amnesty, which feeds the narrative that the 20-point Trump plan is trying to push. Before we go on, be sure to go into the description of this video and download the free ebook that's available there. It is a collection of articles, of columns that I've written and that really provide my analysis since the beginning of the October 7th war, and it'll really give you a window into what we've been through since the war began. So go ahead and download that. Now back to the video. The third headline I want to point to is Ahmad al-Shara, the new president of Syria, the former Al-Qaeda terrorist, who is currently visiting Washington, D.C. Just 2 days ago, the U.S. formally revoked his status as a specially designated global terrorist. So now he's in Washington, D.C. The U.S. has lifted sanctions on Syria, and he becomes the first Syrian head of state to visit the United States in a very, very long time. And of course, the United States has promised all sorts of incentives to Ashara to set up a peaceful government. Let's remind ourselves again, this is a former ISIS-linked Al-Qaeda terrorist. And the last headline I want to mention is Turkey. Erdogan's Turkey just announced that they've issued arrest warrants for Prime Minister Netanyahu and 36 other Israeli officials. And this is interesting also in light of the fact that Turkey is a close ally of the United States. It's part of NATO. And on February 6th, President Trump signed an executive order sanctioning the International Criminal Court for targeting the U.S. or Israel with arrest warrants. It's interesting that here a NATO ally, an ally of the United States, someone that President Trump considers a close partner, is issuing similar arrest warrants on Israeli officials. I bring all of this up because I believe that all of these headlines point to two key strategic errors that the United States administration is making in its approach to the Middle East. Error number one is the belief held by Westerners, held by the American administration, and this is true of previous administrations as well, whether they were right or left, Democrat or Republican, and that is the belief by Westerners that in the Middle East, like everywhere else in the world, they believe economic incentives are more important than ideology. That they believe that as much as these jihadists speak the language of jihad and speak about holy war and conquering land for Islam and death to Israel and death to Jews, as much as they say that, really at bottom, they're like everyone else and all they really want is money and power. And as long as we give the right incentives for them to have their economic viability and to have some prosperity, really that's what matters, and that will bring them into the family of peaceful nations. We talked about this also in relation to the polling done of Gazans, of the Arabs in Gaza, where I showed you that even the most recent polling shows that the people of Gaza, regardless of how much destruction has been caused to their homes and all of the displacement and the alleged genocide and alleged starvation, despite all of the suffering that they have apparently been through, they're still not in favor of Hamas laying down their weapons, which seems insane. It seems so illogical to a Western mind, because obviously if Hamas were to lay down its weapons and Hamas were no longer to control the Gaza Strip, and all of the plans that President Trump laid out in his 20-point plan were really allowed to move forward, of course it would lead to a better, more prosperous economic life for the people of Gaza. But nevertheless, the people of Gaza would prefer the ideologically driven jihadist group Hamas holding onto their weapons and continuing to fight the Israelis, rather than have them lay down their weapons and move to a more peaceful life. And this error in judgment applies to a lot of situations in the Middle East, where you see this also with the handling of Iran. At the end of the Iran war, when President Trump said that he would allow the Iranians to continue to sell their oil to the Chinese Communist Party, the reasoning that President Trump gave for allowing the Iranians to sell their oil was that they need to rebuild their country after all of the damage that was done during the 12-day war with Israel, as though the Iranian regime would prioritize rebuilding infrastructure and making life better for their people. That was basically what President Trump was saying he wanted to enable. And yet, what's really happening is that Iran is purchasing weapons systems, it's purchasing airplanes, air defense systems. We've talked about this in some previous videos, and it's continuing to funnel tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars to Hezbollah any way that it can. You see, economic incentive for a prosperous, nice life, or a more comfortable life for their people is not a priority for these people. It's not a priority for jihadist Islamists in the Middle East. And I believe that the Trump administration does not really accept this, that they really believe that at bottom, when you give people a better life economically, that should temper the Islamist ideology. And I think it's just not true. And that's a major mistake that they are making. We can see this same mistake coming into play in the courting of Syria. Looking at Ahmed Ashara, this jihadist, this ISIS Al-Qaeda alumnus who took over Syria, thinking that if you offer him the right economic incentives and welcome him into the family of nations, that he's going to drop his jihadism because of the economic incentives, is the same misguided mistake. It's the same error that infects U.S. policy and leads to so many mistakes. It leads to the perpetuation of many of the problems that we're seeing. We have to be clear-eyed and recognize that in the Middle East, those regimes and those groups, those populations that are committed to a jihadist form of Islam, to a violent jihadist form of Islam that wants death to Israel, that wants to take down the West, no accommodation can be made with them. You can't buy them out of their ideology. They are going to pursue those aims. The second error I believe the United States is making, and it affects so much of their Mideast policy, is behaving as though Turkey and Qatar are peaceful actors who are in the same camp in the Arab world, in the Muslim world, as the Saudis and the Emiratis and some of the other truly moderate governments in the Arab world who really want peaceful engagement with the West and not to tear the West down. Now, whether this error is actually a willful blindness or it's actually a miscalculation is immaterial. Bottom line is that whether intentional or not, it is a misunderstanding of the dynamics of the Middle East. Let's recall that the Muslim Brotherhood, who is housed by Qatar, and the Qatari regime is wholly committed to the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood. The leading theologians and clerics of the Muslim Brotherhood hold prominent positions in Qatar, is also the ideology of Erdogan in Turkey, and it's also the ideology of Ashara in Syria. He comes from the Al-Qaeda, ISIS groups, which are offshoots of the Muslim Brotherhood, as is Hamas. The Muslim Brotherhood is designated as a terrorist organization by Saudi Arabia, by the United Arab Emirates, by Jordan, and by other moderate Islamic nations in the Middle East. In fact, back in 2017, there was almost a shooting war between the Saudis and Emiratis on the one hand and the Qataris over Qatar's funding of terrorism. And again, Turkey is in the same camp as Qatar in this. Turkey, just the other day, when they issued these arrest warrants for Israeli officials, also made a point of saying that Hamas is not violating the ceasefire and Hamas is committed to fulfilling the Trump plan, which is, of course, nonsense, as we've talked about in earlier videos. So this is a major misstep by the Americans, behaving as though the Turks and the Qataris are good faith actors who actually want ultimately to get rid of Hamas and ultimately want some sort of peaceful engagement with Israel. It's just not true. As long as these two misunderstandings persist, misunderstanding number one, that economics is more important than ideology to these jihadists, and number two, that Turkey and Qatar are good faith actors who are part of the moderate, peaceful Muslim nations who want peaceful engagement and economic engagement with the West and are not pursuing the downfall of Western civilization and the destruction of Israel. These two blind spots by the Americans are going to unfortunately lead to more pressure on Israel and many more mistakes in the days to come.